Hello, hello, and welcome to our attendees. Thank you all for joining us for today's pricing webinar. We are live. I see we have about 30 people joining us today. That's wonderful. Welcome, welcome. My name is Megan Ford from the Professional Pricing Society, and I'm very excited to welcome you all to today's pricing webinar entitled Pricing Science Works, How It Can Help You Maximize Your Customers' Lifetime Value, featuring Jim Vaughn of Zilliant. So welcome again. This is our Crowdcast platform, and we have a few housekeeping notes about best practices to utilize this new tool as ways as the best practices to maximize the experience within our pricing webinar. First, this webinar is an offering from the Professional Pricing Society in our ongoing effort to support pricing professional decision makers. PPS does this to bring the best in pricing thought leadership, technology, and resources to our audience and members. So these are the housekeeping items. All of our attendees are in a mute mode and mute session. So if you pay attention to the dashboard on your right-hand side, there is a complete area for you to engage with one another. You can utilize the chat box at the base with the plus sign to write questions and comments while the presentation is taking place, and we'll be able to see it on the right-hand side of the screen. I'll be monitoring myself, and my teammate Darnell will be monitoring the comments as they come in, so feel free to chat away. And at the end of the presentation, we'll review some of the questions and comments that came in on our right-hand side for engagement. Also, below the dashboard in the base of the video, you'll see a question box. This question box is also another place where you can ask a specified question or a specific question pertaining to the content that's shared within today's pricing webinar. And what will happen is the presenter will go back and answer the questions at the end of the presentation, and we'll timestamp it. So going forward, when you watch the replay or decide to share this awesome webinar with someone else, they can view the questions immediately at the bottom and see what time that the question was answered and get right to the meat and potatoes. So that's a great new characteristic that we have for this Crowdcast replay. Keep that in mind as well. You have two ways to contact and communicate with the presenter and ourselves. The question box down below, specifically for our webinar content, and then there's always the engagement box to the right. So chat away and you can connect with one another. In the event if anything goes wrong, if you have a power outage or any type of technical difficulty, we do have your emails. Thank you again for registering, and we will send out email communication as soon as possible, especially pertaining to a replay or another recording of the same content. And finally, all of our attendees do have access to this replay based on the link that we sent you all when you registered. So there's two great things about access to the link. 2 days after today's replay, 48 hours, we're going to send you another email that has a replay link, and you can still engage with not only the presenter, you can also engage with one another. So it's a live link that's going to be functioning for not only 2 days, that's part one. Secondly, throughout the lifetime of the webinar. So feel free to communicate and ask questions as you implement the suggestions and the strategies shared in today's webinar. If you all have any questions, please feel free to ask them again on the box or towards the right. And without further ado, we're going to hop right into today's webinar because we're very excited to feature Jim. So I'm going to read a little bit more about our fabulous presenter and his featured pricing expertise, and then we'll turn the control over to Jim Vaughn, and we'll soak up today's pricing knowledge. So let's talk a little bit about Jim Vaughn. Mr. Vaughn is the author of Stop Racing in a Blindfold, a big data pricing science to drive bigger profits, and that draws on his 20-plus years of pricing across more than 15 industry verticals. Mr. Jim Vaughn has held a number of line management and technical roles, including CIO and CIO product manager, and many executive roles in the U.S. Army and Army Reserve. He is a graduate of the Military Academy at West Point in New York and holds a master's degree in operations research from the Georgia Institute of Technology. He's also a pricing expert at Zilliant. So without further ado, Mr. Jim Vaughn, we're very excited to feature you. Thank you so very much today.
All righty.
Let's turn over to screen control.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes. Can you hear Tammy? Tammy might have an issue with the audio.
Yeah.
Jared can hear us loud and clear. Thank you, Jared.
Okay. So everybody can hear me, or at least most of you, I hope, at this point?
Yes, sounds like everybody can think we're pretty good.
Okay. Hey guys, thanks Megan for the introduction. I want to thank everybody else on the call for choosing to spend a little bit of your valuable time with me in the webinar today. As mentioned, I've been actually doing pricing now for over 25 years across some 15, 16 different industry verticals. What I hope to do today is share with you some insights on how you can use pricing science to help maximize your customers' lifetime value. I'm going to talk about these 4 blocks of information today. Obviously, the meat of the presentation is the middle 2 blocks. First, we're going to talk briefly about some common pricing challenges. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how pricing science can help us solve or address those problems. And then we'll talk about the fundamental concepts that we apply at a little bit greater depth. And then lastly, I'll talk about what kinds of solutions this works well for. And I obviously want to leave plenty of time at the end for questions, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. I kind of like this slide, but I think maybe question 1 is, why is artificial intelligence or pricing science a good fit for B2B business? And I think maybe one answer is that it's simply just a great way to nudge your sellers to price smarter. I think the cartoon kind of reflects, for the most part, the current state in many companies, mainly that bird dogging opportunities and chasing them to ground with effective pricing is still very much an individual sport in most companies. It's either done by sales reps, or it's done by business analysts, or it's done by sales operations people, but it's still an individual sport. So what are those pricing challenges? I think this is a pretty good summary of the usual pain points, but a little setup here. Depending on your business particulars, you might have hundreds to thousands of products and hundreds to thousands of customers, and you undoubtedly have regions or geographies that are unique. And as we all know, something changes every single week. So our pricing challenges in B2B are really these 5 areas. First is scalability. Unless you literally had an army of pricing analysts at your beck and call, it would be essentially impossible to manually keep your prices in tune with every meaningful change in your markets. And as proof of that, I'll simply submit to you that most people find it very laborious to push out even annual price changes. Secondly, I'd say, market agility, and maybe, this is just markets are very volatile and not consistently volatile. And I guess the question is, what's your lag today to respond to changes in the market? Do you measure it in days? Do you measure it in weeks? Or do you measure it in months? That's the real challenge. And the outcome of those is really the middle piece here, which is this pricing staleness issue. Prices get stale, and people then have to resort to kind of one-off promotions as the standard mechanism to try to prevent price staleness. And unfortunately, it's not very focused typically. It's usually more of a shotgun approach, something like an additional 5% off to every customer in June who's buying products X or Y or Z. And one of the things that underpins all of that really is just this lack of good detailed market data in B2B. Market surveys are difficult and often have lots of holes or false prices, which make it often impossible to be highly confident in your market analysis. And so at the end of the day, sales just doesn't buy in. They continue to operate on kind of a gut check level when trying to close a deal. But here's my question for you. Should every sale be treated as an exception? And my answer is no. There's plenty of data out there. People just don't know how to get to it. So some of you may have seen this ad before, but I'm going to run through it. And unfortunately, the audio is not working right now on the platform. So I'm just kind of going to talk through the ad, but you'll probably recognize as it goes through. And I think this ad really talks to some of the points that I just mentioned. So what this guy is wondering is, the buyer's really into the car and he's wondering, am I going to get a good deal? And what he does is he puts some data in and he gets back a range of prices. And what we find is that somebody got a really good deal and somebody paid a little bit more than the other. And, so that I think is the challenge. And you note that I think it's interesting that even in this ad, they end with the idea of simplicity and data. But maybe a question at this point is, what does everybody think this ad is really saying in 10 words or less? In my mind, what it says is there is no one right price. In fact, we saw a wide range of viable prices in the market, and that's the final screen capture here. But what's the practical outcome of that? It's really kind of the banner across the bottom. Unless you offer a price that meets the buyer's perception of value, no money is going to change hands. But there's also a seller's challenge. And I think the seller's challenge is here, how do you avoid giving someone the deal of a lifetime that we saw in this ad? And how do you avoid doing that inadvertently? That's the challenge. And I think, part of the answer to that question starts with these numbers. And I think they sum up pretty well where we are today and where we're going and how we're going to get there. According to surveys that probably some of you have filled out, just about everyone who is a practicing pricer recognizes the need for some sort of software to aid in this process, which is great. In fact, Gardner estimates by just next year that 40% of you will be using some sort of price optimization or configure price quote software to help with smarter and faster pricing. But for many, the answer on what to do and how to get there is still not very clear. Today, only about 15% of companies are likely to be using some sort of pricing optimization analytics techniques. So the market has identified that we need to do something, and adoption to date has been a little bit slow, but it is, I think, beginning to accelerate based on that 40% metric above. So what's the limiting factor here? Well, based on the conversations I've had over the years with many people in industry, one of the first things is just simply confidence that pricing analytics or pricing science actually works. So your next likely question here is, well, where has it been successfully used? This certainly is not a comprehensive list, but it is a rather long list. I think, simply put, many B2B companies have successfully been using pricing science for years to drive bigger profits and execute better. You can look at the list, and we'll just pause for a second. But I think the question is, do you see your company's category in that list someplace? It's not a complete list, but certainly the breadth of the list, I think, would indicate to you that pricing science is both cutting edge and broadly applied. Okay. So what did all those companies do to address their business needs? Well, they were able to start to maximize their customer lifetime value, but that required them to define a goal or a strategy before you can optimize one. But why? Well, ensuring customer lifetime value involves really protecting your customer base and your longer term company prosperity. And to do that, you can decide to do one or more of these things at the top of the slide. You can grow with existing customers since they represent the core of your business. You can retain existing customers longer because it's cheaper than acquiring new customers. And you can grow more profitably with your customers by pricing smarter. I think the challenge here, the business complexity, really is that sales teams are stretched in many directions. And customer and product loads are increasing. Volatility isn't going to go away. It's going to remain to be a key challenge. And sales turnover will remain a big challenge. So we often find that We also find that pricing for existing customers is usually very different than for new customers. So that's yet another challenge that has to be wickered into this whole process. So here's my question for you. If the 20%, if you believe that 20% of the time you are overpriced or 50% of the time you are underpriced, you really can't be maximizing your customers' value. You're just hoping that your customers don't notice that 20%. And really, hope is not a very good strategy. Whether you think that 50% and that 20% number are exactly accurate for your company, it really doesn't affect the conclusion. The conclusion's still the same. You have to have a strategy, and it could be different for different customers at different times. So what's the impact on B2B pricing leaders? Well, applying AI to pricing problems is pricing science, but pricing science is not going to be your salvation. It's just a tool. It can't replace smart sales reps, and it's not intended to. That said, it does bring to the table a variety of techniques that you produce insights that people find useful. Every company has unique market challenges, and picking the right tools for the right job is always key. That's why effectively building a pricing science capability is not just turning on some black box. It involves working with sales, working with marketing, working with finance to understand the go-to-market intent and identify what the drivers of price are in your markets. One of the ways I like to talk about this sometimes is, you got to pick the right tool for the right job. You certainly wouldn't pick heart surgery tools for your next eye surgery, nor would you pick carpentry framing tools to put in your next paved stone driveway. So having the experience to pick the right tools for the particular problems you're trying to address is key. With a defined market strategy, we can address a lot of different kinds of pricing problems, and depending on your particular business needs, they could be something like you want to discount more upfront earlier in your customer relationship to grow your wallet share for certain kinds of customers or certain market segments, and then later you want to grow profitability over time, or you might have a slightly different strategy. The point is that pricing science allows you to bring to bear those new skills and generate new prescriptive guidance, or what I'll call action-focused insights, to help your sales reps start every price discussion with a market-informed price range or price point that better executes the company's strategy. So that's a lot of words, and I know a lot of times people have trouble. This is kind of back to this will it really work for me question that I mentioned up front, is they have a hard time framing this phrase prescriptive guidance. So here's my very non-technical way of thinking about the idea of prescriptive pricing guidance in a completely non-pricing sort of way. How many of you have been hiking on some national park trail? Maybe some of you, but regardless, I think all of you can imagine this kind of sequence of events. Your guide might say something like, I've hiked this trail before, and on today's trail, we're going to cross 4 different rope bridges. Well, that's descriptive analytics, okay? Next, the guide might say, and we're going to cross those bridges in this order: a 4-rope bridge, a 3-rope bridge, a 2-rope bridge, and then a 1-rope bridge. Well, that's predictive. So what's prescriptive? Well, the guide might say something like, if you want to cross safely, okay, I've got some objectives. On the 4-rope bridge, I suggest you walk slowly, keep your hands on the upper ropes, and don't let go. Carefully position your, and don't bounce as you go across the bridge. On the 3-rope bridge, obviously a slightly different challenge. And the guide would say something like, I recommend you hold on to both the upper ropes firmly. Carefully place your foot at a knot on the lower rope and don't bounce again. On the 2-rope bridge, the guide might say something like, I think the best approach here is to lash yourself to the top rope. Always hold on with both hands. Slide your feet on the lower rope. Don't step. Don't lean. Stay vertical. And just realize that, monkeys have an advantage over humans here. And lastly, when you get to that 1-rope bridge, the guide might say, I strongly suggest you lash yourself to the rope and cross very carefully. And you can hope to stay dry, but don't count on it. So prescriptive means providing insight and recommending a behavior to achieve your goals. And we'll come back to that a little bit later on. So jumping back into pricing, step 1 in pricing science is determining what are real price segments. And step 2 in pricing science is determining the price sensitivity in every segment of the market. Step 1 creates effective price response segmentation. Step 2 can't be done until after you've done step 1. Without segmenting based on the market's perception of value, back to our ad, essentially willingness to pay or price sensitivity, you can't group transactions together and understand if raising price will drive away business or whether lowering price will likely stimulate demand. So in this particular slide, what's each group's willingness to pay? You just look at the groups and you'd say, well, it's pretty obvious that one is probably much more willing to pay for a tea time at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning versus, say, sometime on Tuesday. One of those days is highly associated with or highly correlated with congestion on the golf course. And on Tuesday, the golf course is usually not very crowded, whereas Saturday it usually is, and Tuesday tea times may come with a discount. Similarly, if you, say, live in DC or someplace that has a subway, you'd know that traveling, the subway is most congested during the morning rush hours, Monday through Friday, and that you'd have to pay more if you wanted to be on the subway at that time of day. If you don't want to pay more, then you would avoid using the subway during those rush hours, and you'd be demonstrating by that behavior that you were a more price-sensitive customer. Okay? So pricing science can determine the predominant drivers of price acceptance in the market. Maybe the top 8 to 12 strongest factors, not just things like day of week or time of day that are more important in, say, B2C, but nonetheless, they reflect higher perceptions of value as revealed in higher prices, or the reverse, they reflect lower prices and lower value to those customers. This allows you to determine if you could or you shouldn't raise price in some micro segments of the market. And think about it this way. There are thousands of combinations that every highly experienced sales rep knows will be a winner or a dog. And then there are lots and lots of gray area combinations in between. In a traditional BI world, most companies slice by customer size or industry or geography or product line or some factor to see if they can find a useful pattern in the trend of the prices. And then they use that to guide them on what to do. But in pricing science, we take the exact opposite approach. The first thing we do is group your data based on similar price response in order to see what the attributes are that are in common and reflect that price sensitivity in your data. Let me say that again. Pricing science approaches the problem in the exact opposite way. We group data based on similar price response, and then we look to see what the factors are that are driving those higher or lower market valuations of your product. Rather than doing what we do in normal BI types of work, which is determining the attributes up front and then looking for a trend. AI typical techniques include things like clustering and regression analysis and other statistical tools that have been used for years to solve scalability, trending, competitor actions kinds of problems in those businesses that we looked at earlier. And that allows them to keep their prices in sync with the market. So let's talk about step one, pricing science step one. What are the market's various perceptions of value? So in this particular slide, put that another way, how many viable price points are there for each of your products? That's what we need to find out, because that's where lift comes from having more viable prices in the market. That allows you to minimize the chance that you go in too high and you price yourself out of a deal early. You minimize the chance that you go in too low and could have gotten more. And it also minimizes your competitor's window of opportunity to steal the business. As you can see on the right in the slide, if I'd lowered some prices to say price point 1 or price point 2, I could have sold more in those segments. And if I'd asked for higher prices at price point 4 or 5, I could have made more money on the same sales. So this is why effective price response segmentation is important, figuring out how many viable prices you really can have in the market. So let's visualize what I just kind of talked about. A way to think about price segmentation is kind of like the old Plinko game from the game show The Price is Right. Assume that we've used some sort of AI techniques to start with, and we have identified the strongest drivers of price in every corner of your market. Then we can group all your transactions according to those attributes. So let's kind of watch how this is. This isn't obviously how we do it, but it's the best animation I've come across that kind of explains the concept. So we take your historical transactions for the last year or 2 years, and we interrogate those transactions, if you will, with the outcome of that pricing science analysis. And then once we have done that, we can group them into small clusters, and then we can look at the price elasticity of each of those clusters of transactions by looking at the price distribution shape in each segment. So here's an example. Let's say that we have done our analysis, and what we determined was a very simple model, that it was some sort of channel and some sort of brand indicator, and whether it was a low or high revenue product, and region, what region of the country is this transaction from, and some sort of cost group for that product. And so what we do is we would pass it through this kind of filter approach, and we would say, well, what channel are you? And then what brand are you? And are you a high or low revenue SKU? And what region of the country are you from? And what's your cost group? And then we would put it in that bucket. And then we'd have another transaction, and we'd ask it the exact same questions. Channel, brand, high or low revenue, main runner or not. What part of the country are you from? Cost group. And we'd put you in another bucket. And we'd keep passing all of your transactions through this process until we've created these small clusters that represent the most significant combinations of price drivers in your business. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. So then we take those and we look at one segment. So you can see here I've got channel 2, brand B, high revenue SKU, region X, and high cost group. And what I'm doing is I'm looking at, to kind of orient you a little bit, the market price traction on the y-axis is how many times have you sold at that particular price? Not the quantity sold, but the number of transactions sold at a given price point. And what we're trying to get at is where is the middle of the market and what is the spread of prices in the market, so that we can then use that to get at the price sensitivity or willingness to pay. And we can look at this particular slide and say, well, clearly there's one price where a lot of traction in the market and there's a particular drop-off on either side of that. And so we would say that this is, moderately to highly sensitive price segment. So let's look at a slightly different example. This one looks a bit more like what we saw in the TV ad. Remember that the spread of prices in the market reflects the customer's perception of value, so there's no one right price. And segmenting based on rule-based groupings is not price response segmentation. Like I said earlier, it's just kind of this ad hoc BI reporting of slicing and dicing the data based on gut feel or hunches. And then somebody can always challenge the actionability of any picture or report that is generated that way. Instead, if we've gone through this segmentation process, I think what you could conclude is that if you knew where the middle of the market price was for a certain set of conditions, it would certainly make it much easier for sales to negotiate smarter. So let's say we're looking at this particular segment again, and the current price on the table is somewhat to the left of the middle of the market price. And so let me orient you on the chart. Higher prices are to the right, lower prices are to the left on the x-axis, and the frequency with which you've been able to transact at a particular price is, again, kind of this curved line. So this particular price is well below the middle of the market, and the question you would ask is, should I try to negotiate higher? And I think most of us would probably say yes. On the other hand, if the price were over here close to the upper end of the distribution, and you ask the same question, the chances are you'd say, no, I think we're doing pretty good there. It's not likely that we want to try to push higher under those circumstances because there's very limited demand above that price point. Let's look at a different case. Again, the exact same orientation, higher prices to the right, lower prices to the left, and the curved line represents the market price traction, how often you have sold at a particular price. And again, this is segment by segment. So here, if you saw that the current price was way far down on the tail, and you asked the question, would I try to negotiate higher? Yes, you probably would. Hopefully you wouldn't even go in with that lower price to start with. On the other hand, if the current price on the table in discussion is just above the middle of the market price, and somebody said, well, should we try to get a little bit more out of this deal? Maybe the conclusion is very different. There's demand drops off rather dramatically above that price point. And so while you might try to get a little bit more, I think you'd probably be very content to be where you are. Lastly, I've got a third example. And after that, we're done with these examples. So what if the spread of prices looked something more like this? What is this really saying? Again, higher prices to the right, lower prices to the left, and a pretty uniform spread. There's not a specific price that has a lot more market traction than the others. What if your price was here? Would you try to negotiate higher? I think the answer is certainly you would try to. If your price were here up near the high end of that range, would you try to negotiate higher? Maybe, but you're certainly not going to go much higher, right? So here's another question to ponder with this particular type of situation. Given that there seems to be a general indifference in the market over a kind of a wide range, do you think you could move that price on the left all the way up to where that green line is on the right? Or is there some limit on how big an increase a customer might be willing to accept? I think there is. And so you have to build that into your solution. So earlier I said there are maybe 8 to 12 strong factors that explain why prices are higher or lower in any particular microsegment. And of course, I can't show you a cube with 8 to 12 different dimensions, but I think you'll get the idea with just 3. So if I have small, medium, large customers and some sort of geography and a few products, you can see that I would have for any one product 3 regions and 3 OISs, which would give me 9 different distributions of pricing to understand just for that one product. So if I build on that idea, and I take one product with 6 different important geographies and 5 different customer industries that are important, again, things that we get out of the pricing science analysis, and 4 different customer sizes or tiers, and 3 different order quantity tiers, then you could very reasonably expect to have 6 times 5 times 4 times 3, or 360 different distributions of market pricing that you potentially would need to understand. And it's easy to see how you could have thousands of cases where you might want to execute slightly differently if you only knew, if you had insights at that kind of level of detail. What if your company wants to grow market share and somebody says, well, let's lower price slightly? Lowering price won't generate additional demand. That's not a good idea. Likewise, if the CFO says they want to reclaim some margin erosion and raise price, then could you do that? Well, maybe in some segments where you see there is an opportunity to raise price because there is additional demand, where is the middle of the market and are you priced below the middle of the market, then you'd certainly be more successful there. But again, this is a visibility problem. So I think that the point here is that, to put things differently, you can know if the price change you're considering is likely to drive customers away or drive bigger profits, and you can know that before you put new prices in the market. So let's go back and revisit my earlier slide and say, using some AI techniques, we might have found that rather than this one large cluster of what seems to be general price indifference, that there are actually additional clusters or segments in the market. Because normal BI often is this hunch-driven analysis that I talked about earlier. A lot of times it produces things that are not particularly actionable because it is looking at, I'm going to call it, high-level cuts of the data. Traditional BI views are often typically descriptive, kind of like my hiking trail example. They can give you a snapshot of what happened. Sometimes they can be predictive. They can tell you what you might see in the near future, but seldom are they prescriptive and tell you what actions you should take depending on your current business objectives. We might have concluded that a price was below the middle of the market, my blue line, in our earlier analysis, but after we've done some additional work, we find out that that blue line isn't actually below the middle of the market, it's above the middle of the market in this other cluster that wasn't detected earlier. So what are these potential 3 different new clusters that we have along the bottom? Well, they could be order line quantity, small, medium, large orders, or at a line basis. It could be customer tenure, something like new, short, long-term customer tenure. It could be customer spend, small, medium, large, or it could be something like low, medium, high competition circumstances. It could be a lot of things where you'd want to price slightly differently if you just knew that the situation was different and that the market perception of value was different. So going a little bit farther on that, here's some other ideas. What might these things also represent? And the idea is that pricing science would allow you to potentially investigate any or all of these things. So it could be small, medium, large order line quantity, like we talked about, or something slightly different, like small, medium, large total order size, or new, medium, long-term customer tenure, or some sort of product life cycle stages, or some sort of grouping of good, better, best products, or low, medium, high purchase frequency. There are lots of possibilities on the right. I think the key here is being able to investigate these attributes and others like it to determine if there are important factors when you couple them with your business goals or strategies, because that's what would allow you to have market-aware guidance that actually handles these kinds of cases and stays in sync with the market as it moves over time and stays in sync with your business strategies as they move over time. And then you'd actually have this prescriptive price guidance that we talked about. So as my final comments, last two slides, guys, so I appreciate you hanging on. From a business point of view, where does pricing science work well? Well, in the 25 years that I've been doing this and the 15, 16 different industries that I've worked in, here's where I see a good fit. You can certainly read my slide, but let me give you some other thoughts. I like to see at least 100 products, and we typically see hundreds to thousands of products. I like to see at least 400 to 500 customers, and usually we see thousands of customers spread across a number of channels and geographies. Good price differentiation is really a tough one. It's very industry specific and channel specific, but it's not unusual to see somewhere between 75 and 100 different price points per product, up to maybe 500 price points per product, and sometimes even more. Pricing science works well with a variety of types of products. So it could be just what I'm going to call standard SKUs. It could be configured to order SKUs or made to order SKUs or blended products or even custom products, things that you don't actually ever sell the same product twice. It also could be things that are very different, things like commodities versus niche products, and it could be others. So that's not a limitation. We also typically address a variety of types of agreements. Sometimes customers want to have long-term contracts because they value price stability for certain circumstances, and other times they may value more project-like pricing because, say, they need additional quantities, so they want maybe a better deal but for a shorter period of time. Sometimes they may be very opportunistic and they want to have spot market pricing or one-time pricing. And I think this one's interesting because it could be, one, they want the lowest price, or two, it could be they're in a real bind and they're very price insensitive. The question to ask really is, who's buying the risk and why? Okay. Lastly, it's the norm to handle a lot of different go-to-market approaches. It could be direct, where you're selling to an OEM or some other end user. It could be indirect, where you're selling through a distributor or an agent kind of function, something that happens a lot in the electrical business and others. And it could be more like web or internet types of sales where little to nothing is known about the buyer. Regardless, B2B pricing science can give you an edge in all of these different kinds of cases. So we're down to my last slide. In summary, a core challenge has always been in B2B that we haven't had a good way to see if we were leaving money on the table or pricing ourselves out of an opportunity. But pricing science brings to the table some additional techniques, and when coupled with a well-defined pricing goal or strategy, can help you maximize your customer's lifetime value and give you that edge in the market. The ability to manage prices at this micro market level of detail just wasn't feasible before. It was possible to scale something like this with human eyeballs. But with an AI-driven pricing science type of bet, you can drive more profits by addressing the 5 sellers pricing challenges we talked about at the beginning of the webinar. And you can do that in a coherent, consistent way that you can control. So always keep in mind that there's no one right price. There are lots of right prices, and even in every micro segment, there are a range of viable prices, each with different market transaction. So I want to thank you for your time and turn it back over so that we can maybe get some questions in. So let me stop sharing.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you so very much. I thought that was a wonderful presentation, and based on the engagement and the questions that came in, I would agree that we'll assume and get facts to prove that everyone else was in agreement as well. Thank you so very much. I've got a few housekeeping notes in closing, and then I'm going to jump right into the questions. I just want to remind all of our attendees that there will be a copy of the playback sent to you all within 48 hours. So if there's anything that you missed, don't hesitate to check your inbox by Friday. You should have access to the link. And we're going to also have the link be live. We're going to keep it live. So if you want to ask additional questions as well, you're more than welcome. We have received a few questions in our bottom box, and as we're asking these four, if you're still engaged and you want to ask a question, please do. Let's just hop into the questions, and then I'll close with the housekeeping notes. All right, first question, Jim, are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay?
Yes.
Okay, and then we'll do housekeeping. Okay, our first question that came in. To what degree is pricing science successful in the healthcare industry, where influencers, considered regulatory bodies, insurers, payers, etc., play such a big role other than the buyers?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. In the pricing science field, there are a number of places that we've done a couple of different kinds of solutions, some of which I've been directly involved in, others I simply know about. Let me talk about the ones that I'm involved in. So in healthcare, there are a lot of products that are sold into clinics or hospitals or those kinds of things that are some sort of competitive buy situation. They are, anything from tongue depressors to surgical sponges to a whole bunch of things like that. Those aren't really any different than other kinds of B2B business. The hospitals may be more or less price sensitive. They may buy in larger bulk, smaller quantities, those kinds of things. And that's actually a very good fit. There are some other things that are more like, I'll call it healthcare. When people think about it, they say, well, who's paying for the healthcare? That is a different kind of problem, but it again is pricing science can solve it, but it's not something that I've personally been involved in. I do know people who do this. And if you think about it, whether you're selling an insurance product or some sort of healthcare product, the product is the product, but somebody has to administer the product. So if you've got an insurance agent who's outbidding on something, this is where the problem kind of morphs into kind of a fee control problem. You're not actually paying. The healthcare is what it is, but somebody's got to administer it. And so it's a service kind of issue. And it's a fee control. Where did you get certain kinds of businesses that are willing to pay slightly higher fee control or slightly lower fee control? And the segmentation would address that kind of problem. Hopefully it answers your question.
Thank you, Jim. I don't see if anybody said anything.
Nope, I think we lost you. All right, I think we lost them due to some audio issue. I'm not sure if anybody can. Oh,
that was me. I apologize. I was just talking. Can you see me now?
I did. I was just saying, I think we lost you, and I was going to see if anybody else was out there, but okay, great.
No, I apologize. Can everybody see and hear me now? Yes?
I can hear you.
Okay, wonderful.
Yes.
Yes.
Somebody said yes. Okay, good.
Thank you, Danielle. Okay. The next question, when you talk about grouping the data by price response, do you mean price response as price elasticity?
No, what I'm thinking about here really is the idea of, we do a variety of things, but you could be looking at, I'll call it the raw dollar denominated or currency denominated price. That's not what we typically do a lot of, but sometimes that. Other times we will look at, say, the price relative to some benchmark. So maybe that benchmark is the list price, or maybe that benchmark is some sort of market index that's readily available, or maybe it's some sort of replacement cost. And what you're trying to get at is the relative value of one transaction against a second transaction. And so you're trying, over time, obviously, those benchmarks might change. Your list price might change over time. The index might change over time. The cost might change over time. But what you're getting at is, did I get, relatively speaking, more value out of one transaction than the other. And that's the price response that we're looking at. Could be dollars. We certainly do that in some occasions. More often than not, it's a relative value based on some metric that was in place at the time of the transaction and the net price of the transaction.
Thank you. We've got another question. What is the best way to obtain the competitor's price in B2B since prices change in every negotiation? The example is sometimes the same item is sold by different prices in the same customer. And thank you.
They certainly are sold by different prices to the same customer, and I kind of talked a little bit about that. It could be that a customer has a long-term, let's say I'm dealing with a large OEM, and they might have a long-term contract with you because they really value price stability for the period of that product being in production. You know, they want to manage their costs just like you want to manage your predictable revenue stream. They might come back to you and have a second contract where they are buying repair parts in case something breaks and they have to repair it. Well, you may not have the same price on your production line for that product when you're selling into the OEM for that product as you are selling a repair part to the same OEM. And they might have a special run yet again that gets at, you know, we've got to do something special. I'm much more willing to pay a much higher price because I'm trying to remediate some particular problem with the OEM's customer. But getting to what is I'll call it the competitor's price, the way I think about this, and it really goes back to this lack of market transparency issue that we talked about, number 4 on that slide, which was that getting good market data is extremely difficult. Sometimes our customers have what they believe is really granular competitor market information, and you can roll that into the optimization so that it's used, again, almost like a reference point. But more often than not, it's not available at the same level of granularity as the actual transactions that customers have for their own products. Not too surprising. So when you're looking at that distribution of prices in a segment, you can see where you have been successful at selling, and you can see where you haven't been successful at selling. And to some extent, you can infer from that lack of transactions, perhaps where some of your competitors are owning the market, right? So if you are below a certain point, you have very little demand. It could be that you have a competitor out there that is the low price provider in the market. And so that competitive information is implicitly embedded in your transactional information. But how do you get better, market survey information? Not something I've done a lot of. I don't put a lot of faith in that market survey information because, as I've described it before, people don't always tell you the truth when you ask them, well, what am I competing against? So I think there are a couple of ways to get at that, but that certainly, I think, addresses what you were trying to get at, hopefully.
Thank you, Jim. We've got about 2 more questions. The next is, are price responses really measurable when your business is predominantly a qualification business? For example, if your business is selling links to OEM printer manufacturers and your ink is qualified for a printer model, the demand for the ink will not change in response to the price. In addition, the ink SKU is dedicated to just one customer.
Yeah, if you have, I'm going to call it a single customer kind of SKU situation, what we probably want to do is not look at just the individual SKU, but to do some sort of pricing at a level above SKU, because they're certainly related SKUs. And what you'd want to get at is the relative value of actually serving this single customer that's buying a single product. How do you allocate your resources as a company to make the most money, right? And so you'd want to look at related SKUs and say, what is the relative value of the transactions for those related SKUs, as well as the value of the transactions for the specific SKU in question, and decide, should I be able to get more? These customers are in general buying, this similar products. Can we get more out of the deal? So that's where pricing at a SKU level probably is not the optimal way to look at the business problem at hand.
Thank you, Jim. Another question? Let's scroll up. Oh, I got another question. How do you handle having so many SKUs due to the slight differences in product and value price that while there are thousands of customers, many services only have a few sales over several years?
This is actually very much related to the other question. And sometimes we don't do SKU level pricing for certain kinds of SKUs. There may be SKUs that are, I'm going to call them high runners, and businesses actually want, for the low runners, for the seldom sold SKUs, they don't want necessarily to try to price them independently. They want to price them in relationship to some other product that they're selling, because they don't want to undercut the market, or they want to drive particular demand from, say, an older model that has a lot of sales to a newer version of something, and they want to use price as a mechanism to do that. So for truly low volume SKUs, a lot of times what we do in our models is have a segmentation attribute that looks at essentially some tier or qualification criteria and says, these SKUs we want to price at a level above or in relation to something that is a much higher runner type of SKU. A lot of capabilities there, a lot of different options, but that's one approach.
Thank you, Jim. And our very last question is just a personal question for you, and it's, what is your favorite price mode?
I think it's probably negotiated pricing, because that's where I started, at least on the B2B side. I mean, I've done everything from rental car pricing to hotel pricing to airline pricing to cruise line pricing to even apartment rental pricing, which is very unique. But for the last almost 10 and a half years, I've been doing B2B pricing, and I really kind of like the negotiated aspect of it. But tier pricing is also an interesting problem, because there's usually a lack of information around tier pricing or matrix pricing that makes it a little bit harder to wrap your head around. So I don't know, maybe I'm indifferent.
Thank you, Jim. We appreciate you taking this time out to answer these awesome questions. And again, to all of our attendees, the live link will remain, so you can continue to ask questions during the playback if something sparks your interest, or you'd like to get in touch with Jim again. Jim, thank you so very much for your time and your expertise today. We greatly appreciate it. I'm going to close out with the last few bit of housekeeping notes, and I'm going to let us close out for this fabulous pricing webinar. I want to remind everybody, oh, Jim left.
No, I'm here. I'm on.
Okay.
I just turned off my camera.
Thank you, Jim, for joining us. We want to thank you again. If you would like to learn more about pricing science and how it can vastly improve your business, please register for Zilliant's IQ event series at an upcoming city near you. You can visit Zilliant.com at www.zilliant.com/events for more details. Also, Zilliant will be launching a pricing webinar series mid-September, and you can check back at Zilliant.com for more information as well. Thank you all to all of our attendees, and as you heard during our opening, the Professional Pricing Society is excited to bring you all pricing webinars on the regular. You can check our website for additional pricing webinar information as well as follow our social media accounts on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn for more information and around-the-clock pricing news, events, shares, and strategy suggestions. We also have a fabulous pricing podcast that you can get into as well. We're the #1 audio pricing podcast on the interwebs. So you can't get enough pricing. You can't think about pricing without the Professional Pricing Society, and you can find us any and everywhere online. Lastly, we'd love to invite you all to the 28th Annual Fall Pricing Workshops and Conference in San Diego, California this October. We are opening registration. Registration is now open. The full layout of our fabulous speakers and presenters is available to view online. You can just check out the hashtag PPSSD17 for all of the conference news and events, as well as visit our website, www.pricingsociety.com, and check out the conference information. It's the very first page on our website, and check out Fall Pricing Conference. We cannot wait. We're very excited. And the early bird pricing and details in by September 15th. So get on it. Make sure you share that with your team. If you have any questions, reach out to us at professionalpricingsociety.com. We thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the playback 2 days from now in your inbox. And until next time, you all have a great day. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Goodbye.